Okay, hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to this first ASEN webinar on nationalism and multiculturalism. We're very pleased to have everyone here today, and I know unfortunately so many conferences have been cancelled this year and ours as well. But at least we've been able to take this opportunity to now have a series of online events. So this one is the first. But just to let you know that we're planning quite a lot more. We have an early career workshop that our colleague Elinor is organizing for late August. So please look up our social media and our webpage for that. And we also have another webinar on secession coming up. So again, please look the details up. But I think we can start today with today's webinar. I'm Daphne. I think many of you may know me. I'm Daphne Haligopoulou. I'm the Vice President of ASEN, and today I will be chairing this event. We have three excellent speakers that will talk to us about nationalism and multiculturalism. The first one I would like to introduce is Professor Anna Triandafyllidou. I will say that in a Greek pronunciation because I'm Greek as well. She holds the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson University, and she will be talking to us today reflecting on nationalism and multiculturalism and COVID-19. So I will pass on to Anna to start with.
Thank you very much, Daphne. Yeah. It was great that I didn't have to rehearse with you my last name, as it usually happens. Because you will say, okay, how do you pronounce this? And I'm very pleased to meet everyone, although I would have preferred to be in Edinburgh in April. And I look forward to the next occasion when we meet in person. But of course, it's true the webinars allow us this flexibility to connect through time and space. Because it's midday for me, I think it's late afternoon for most people in Europe, early morning for those on the West Coast in North America. So at least we can travel, since we cannot travel in person, we can travel through Zoom and similar softwares. Let me first start by making the land acknowledgement, as I'm right now based in Toronto, which is the land of the Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas, and Anishinaabe people. And I'm here through, how can I say, in paying respect. I'm here as a guest and I'm paying respect to there being the peoples who inhabited these lands for over 10,000 years. And this is truly also an aspect that I am discovering now, speaking about membership and citizenship and nationalism and multicultural nationalism. As I've recently moved to Canada, I moved to Canada in August 2019 to take up this position. And in a way, the COVID has made me even more aware of all these issues of nationalism, citizenship, and membership. And I was saying earlier to Daphne and Jonathan as we connected to check, the voice and everything, that I feel very personal about it, because when Canada closed the border in, I think it was 16th of March, it was a Monday. No, it was 16th of March, it was a Monday. And initially Canada said, the border is closing on Wednesday and it remains open. The only people exempted are citizens and permanent residents. And it so happens that me and my family are not permanent residents yet. And my husband was abroad. So he had just to rush on a plane to come back to Toronto, or we would be geographically separated for quite a long period of time. And it is true, however, and I want to say this, that the Canadian government 4 days later, so on the Friday of that week, said, okay, people who are on a work permit or on a study permit, like international students, people who effectively live in Canada are exempted also from the border closure, which as a good sociologist prompted to me all these questions and about what does membership mean in general, membership of a community, of a political community, and who has the right to what. And I have to say there was something else that also prompted this reflection for me, which was reading about Italy, which was the country I've lived for the previous 10 years before coming to Toronto. And when in Northern Italy, the outbreak happened and some young people who were students in Northern Italian universities rushed to go back home to their parents to wait for this to pass. And of course, I think no one or very few people were expecting this to last such a long time. So not only they went back home, but sometimes they went to visit their grandparents who were in a senior care's home. And there has been a few outbreaks in Sicily and in other parts of southern Italy because of this, because these young people had, at the time, we were all not aware also, or not fully aware, that you may not have symptoms for the first week and you may still have the virus. And that prompted also the question, can governments create borders within a country? Can we restrict citizens from moving from a region to another? Can we close Lombardy? And what is the responsibility of the citizen in responding to this, if you want, this call of the government to stay put, don't leave, don't travel, because this is dangerous for public health. And I think this has, first of all, it has raised, I think, issues of, both sociological, but also, if you want, legal nature. What is membership and who is entitled to what? And as I was saying, Canada took the more generous approach, saying whoever is an effective member of this community is treated, how can I say, in a privileged way compared to visitors and others. The second question is, can we impose borders, territorial borders within the nation state? Right now, also in Canada, we cannot move to many provinces. So for instance, people from Ontario can go to Quebec, but they cannot go, for instance, to the Maritime, so Atlantic Canada, the smaller provinces that look on the Atlantic Ocean, which, if you want, is a preferred holiday destination in the summer. And I think it has raised also a lot of other issues. How do you repatriate people? Do you repatriate only citizens or also effective residents? And when you repatriate citizens, there was another event, or how can I say, incident that hit the headlines at the time. That was an Ecuadorian citizen living in Spain who returned to Ecuador and causing, of course, without wanting it. And she and two members of her family died of COVID. She caused a big outbreak in that city of Ecuador. And there were calls from other Ecuadorian citizens, don't allow the return migrants to come in, just close the border, we cannot cope. And I know there's been some such discussions also in other countries. And something else that we have seen and has been commented also on social media is that migrants, in a way, I mean, we all know, and particularly people like me who have worked a lot on irregular migration, we have called something performance citizenship. So showing you deserve citizenship, showing you deserve legal status through your civically minded behavior when you are an irregular migrant. Now I'm speaking here not about irregular migrants necessarily, but about legal migrants performing citizenship. So wearing a mask, listening to the guidelines of what to do and what not to do to protect yourself and others, and the media commenting, for instance, that East Asian people are more used to wear masks because in their countries of origin, they have more pollution. So they've been wearing masks at times, and they're better citizens than others, regardless of whether they're now, for instance, naturalized Canadians or they are residents, permanent or temporary residents. Another issue of membership that has come up in Canada, but I would believe also in the UK and in other places, is about care workers in the front line, so risking their lives. And in particular, that was the case in Quebec, where some asylum seekers who had come in, and I want to make a small comment here because perhaps people in Europe are not familiar with this. The Canada resettles a lot of refugees. It resettled 50,000 Syrians in the last couple of years, but generally doesn't have asylum seekers in the way we understand them in Europe. Actually here it's called refugee claimants. So people walking through the border and applying for asylum. So actually in Canada after 2015-16, it's been a small crisis, as with the election of the Trump administration, a lot of people walked, voted with their feet, if you want, walked through the border from the US, actually from the state of Maine into Quebec to seek asylum in Canada. And there were many, how can I say, subcategories among them, people who were seeking asylum in the US and they were afraid that they would be rejected, people who had just entered the US to seek asylum, people who had precarious or undocumented status in the US and were fearful of deportation. So some of these people, and Quebec was kind of a frontline state. I don't know how familiar you are with the geography of Canada. Like Ontario also has a border, but somehow it was Quebec the main avenue from Maine. And some of these people, while waiting for their asylum applications to be decided, were trained to go work in the senior care homes because this is not a very desired job, it's not very well paid, and there was a shortage. So, and Quebec has been facing a real crisis under the COVID pandemic, particularly in senior care homes. You may say as all countries, but particularly a lot of staff fell ill. Senior care homes were totally understaffed. And actually at a certain point, the federal government called in the military to bring doctors and nurses. So you can see how important these workers were. And now there is a movement that they should be given a preferential path to refugee status and later to citizenship, because they've served this country, they've served this community in ways that go, if you want, over and beyond what is required from a citizen. And the Quebec government has responded negatively, said, this is queue jumping, we don't do this. And in terms of the advocacy, some people said, yeah, on one hand, we see the point, but then what does this mean? Does this mean that somebody who is seeking protection and is not a senior care home worker should not be given protection? So it raises both ethical and political issues. So I think if we try to theorize all these inputs that actually really prompt us to reopen some questions that we probably considered settled about citizenship and denizenship and other forms of citizenship that are, other types of membership. I think what it comes down to is, do we privilege a normative approach and do we privilege an instrumental approach? And I think we've seen that also, speaking of exemptions, in relation to the migrant workers that were considered essential workers and were allowed through the borders, were actually even brought from other countries with chartered flights, whether in the case of Canada from Mexico and Jamaica, flying into Southern Ontario, in the case of Germany from Romania, in the case of Italy, again, from Romania, or simply from Morocco or Tunisia, because they were essential for the agri-food chain. So they were essential for harvesting or for planting. In Canada, spring was the planting season, and were essential for meat processing and for processing of vegetable and fruit, so as not just to ensure the survival of this business, but also to ensure the supply of food through the supermarkets. And maybe now we feel the emergency in this sense is past, but at the time, you will remember in April and May, there was a concern there would be shortages. But then again, the question arises, what do you do when, with these people? So for instance, in Canada, we have had a new pilot, an agri-food pilot for permanent residency, something that had been discussed for years, 10 years or more, but it was not the case because farm workers do not abide by the prerequisites of the point system in Canada. So they're not highly skilled. So even if they apply for permanent residency, they're very unlikely to get it. So this agri-food pilot aims to fill this gap and, if you want, experiment with this idea. Only it's a very small pilot. It's 3,000, less than 3,000. It's actually, I think, 2,750 people and their families who can apply between now and 2023, while Canada has every year 60,000 people coming to work. We know Italy has done a regularization program, which includes both care and farm workers. We know Portugal did an automatic regularization for 6 months. So this again prompts us to think, on what basis do we take our decisions about membership? And is it instrumental or normative? And I think there's something to be said about the normative aspect being an ethical aspect and not, strictly speaking, political, if you want, question. So there's something ethical to be said about an asylum seeker who keeps working in a senior care home in Quebec while, there is a really huge outbreak going on, to the point that the government is bringing in the army to help. The same is probably true when we speak about how citizenship show their responsibility. So we have seen a lot of, if you want, irresponsible citizens and a lot of members who are not citizens and have been behaving very civically and in the ways we would expect the members of a community, a political community, to behave. On the other hand, the instrumental decision is not so easy because on one hand we see the essential workers, they need to ensure some industries, etc., like care for our seniors, etc. But at the same time, we have seen that there has been a sense of privileging the safety of the citizens. So again, speaking about the example of farm workers in Canada, it's been a bit of a scandal in the last 10 days. Well, 3 farm workers have died, 3 relatively young men from Mexico. Now you might say, is this a big number? I mean, I don't know. We all have one life to live. But what this number, I mean, this case is prompted to was an inquiry which found that while the government gave special allowances to the employers to ensure that the farm workers, when they come in, can self-isolate for 14 days so they don't pose a threat to the local community and the local towns where they would be hanging out, because obviously they stay for several months to work. After the 14 days, there was no provision, there was no checking on the employers, there were no checking on the housing and living conditions, or if these people have protective gear when they work. So that led to some community outbreaks. So what have we learned? And in order not to monopolize any more of our time in this webinar, and I'll be happy to take further this discussion during the Q&A. I think what we're learning is that the pandemic makes us rethink in some ways what does citizenship mean and what does membership to a community mean, and whether we need perhaps new norms and new rules to consider this both in a social scientific way, but also in terms of policy. It prompts us to face some dilemmas which are instrumental and normative. And I think maybe the normative answers are easier to find than the question is how you translate them into policy and how you talk about them in public opinion, I think. And another thing that the pandemic has shown is that we're all vulnerable. And I think this is a lesson that I would like to take away, and I would hope most of us take away, is that we thought that asylum seekers are vulnerable. People who come from war zones are vulnerable. You know, single-handed, disadvantaged households are vulnerable. People with precarious status are. But we have found that both of us, highly skilled workers and transnational, you know, globetrotters, but also the, how can I say, more normal, you know, citizens are vulnerable, and this vulnerability has little to do with the status of citizenship, because we've seen a lot of normal aspects of our lives disrupted. So I would want to hope that in our future, both scientific and policy deliberations, we take this lesson home and rethink, you know, the way we understand membership in ways that privilege empathy and solidarity rather than exclusion. And I'd like to, to leave it at that, Daphne.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna, for your really interesting reflections about how COVID-19 has exposed a series of tensions and what it means about how we apply and how we understand citizenship, and about how borders, I mean, most of us would have argued perhaps not too long ago that maybe borders are becoming obsolete, and yet, you know, overnight, they were not obsolete. So very interesting. I just want to tell everyone that obviously we have a Q&A after the remaining talks, but you are welcome to use the Q&A little box at the bottom of your screens. I'm sure you've been to webinars before, you know how it works. Feel free to put your question there, and I will be collecting questions and we'll post them to the speakers after the end. But to not take too much longer, I would like to introduce our second speaker, who is the president of the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism, is Professor Jonathan Hearn. Is a professor of political and historical sociology and the head of sociology at the University of Edinburgh. And as I said, also the president of our association. And I look forward to hearing his thoughts. To you.
Okay, thank you, Daphne. And thanks to Anna and Christian for joining us on this somewhat impromptu make up for having to cancel the conference. I think I just make a few points. One is kind of opening points. One is that I don't work very directly on multiculturalism, so I'm a bit inclined to defer to Anna and Christian on this topic. But you know, I think a lot about concepts and nationalism studies, and so I'll just say what I have to say about some of the conceptual equipment. we very carefully worded the title of this webinar, so it sort of implied that we might make some predictions, but we didn't promise to make any predictions. And in that spirit, I will try to make my comments lead towards some careful stabs at what are the effects of COVID or the longer term effects. But that's with the proviso that academics are terrible at predicting the future, and it's always a risk when you try and speculate on these things. And then, just as I was saying a second ago, I mean, because I don't have any particular ongoing research on the topic, I'm more inclined to just sort of interrogate some of the main concepts. And so I thought I'd just say some things, that often, go through my head when I'm thinking about multiculturalism. First, about what we mean by the concept of culture, and then secondly, about how it relates to the concept of nation building, which for other reasons, other things I've been writing lately have been on my mind. So it's to a degree a kind of just convergence of different things that you're working on. But let me talk about those two kind of conceptual aspects and things that often puzzle me. Obviously, in regard to culture, the concept of multiculturalism supposedly rests on the concept of culture, right? Multiple cultures. But I often find myself wondering what do we mean by culture in this context? Very often, multiculturalism is aligned with kind of broad social identity categories, race, ethnicity, religion, language, increasingly even genders and sexualities are there in the mix. But I often find myself puzzling over in what sense are these identity categories that are part of the general kind of public cognitive way of dividing up the world. What do they have to do with culture in particular? Are these things the same thing as cultures? And to elaborate on that point a bit, it often seems to me that, especially in the social sciences, you find thinner and thicker versions of what we mean by culture. There's what I would call the thin version tends to take the form of thinking of culture very specifically as an ideational level of analysis, where you're dealing with things like ideas, beliefs, symbols, systems of meaning, myths, but that it is kind of within that range that you're talking about culture. That is what culture is this kind of ideational stuff, maps of the world that people can contain in their heads and share with each other. Whereas what I would mean by a thicker version of culture would be culture understood as a correspondence between that ideational stuff and more structural, institutional, organizational aspects of how society is put together. And this kind of harks back to a more kind of traditional anthropological sense of understanding of culture as a set of ideas that correspond to a life way that's related to getting, a livelihood out of the environment in a very particular way that's somewhat materially determined. And so I find myself, sort of thinking, well, what's to what do which of those concepts of culture are really relevant when we're thinking about multiculturalism? I would also say that I think culture generally, I lean towards the second thicker version of culture that I'm talking about, and I think it's there's more explanatory bite when you can connect these systems of ideas to more material underpinnings that often have to do with how people share certain kind of basic power relations with each other and how they organize their lives, but also maybe a culture may be a response to a larger set of structures of power relations from which they are excluded, right? But it still has something to do with this more kind of organizational and institutional infrastructure. And so the question is, how does that sense, are these broad categories, race, ethnicity, or particular racial groups or ethnic groups or whatever categories you want to use, how do we tie those down to this more kind of concrete sense of, what the underpinnings of culture might be? As to nation building, the other kind of concept I wanted to think about, I mean, there's one concept of nation building that sort of treats it as, a classic concept of it's the early formative stage of how nation states take their shape. And once it's done, it's done. The thing is, up and running. And I've always been quite skeptical about that way of thinking about nation building. I tend to think of nation building as, the labor of Sisyphus. It's never done. It has to be constantly done, kept going, because the question of who we are, what our shared values are, how we want to govern ourselves, these questions are never ultimately resolved. And especially in liberal democratic forms of society, they're even kept on a kind of a slow boil by the very nature of the political system that is constantly asking people to kind of engage in a public debate, and through the political system, through party competition, decide, how they want to answer those questions. So, I think it's, nation building never finishes once nation states are really up and running. It's a kind of a constant part of the process. And I also tend to think of multiculturalism for that reason. And I know I'm not being entirely original about this. Other people have said this, but as itself a kind of the latest version of nation building, right? In the history of that process. So I think, far from the idea that we might have had a kind of previous stage of nation building, which was all about a kind of monolithic, homogenous notion of the nation that is now being pushed against by multiculturalism, which is the opposite. I think the problem of nation building has always been to throw a carapace that is somewhat, artificially covering actual divisions in society. And that's always what's happening at every stage in nation building. So I think in my own, case, I was raised in the United States, and I grew up with that kind of mythic mid 20th century narrative that was kind of dominant from, especially kind of built up from the early to the late mid 20th century of, stories of the Pilgrim forefathers and the Mayflower, and it was all founded on principles of freedom and democracy, and and with a kind of shared Christian underpinning. That narrative indeed was there, and I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and so it was already being challenged when I was a kid, but I recognized that pattern. But I would have to say that, to properly understand what was going on with the constructing of that narrative, we have to bear in mind that it itself was an attempt to cover over the diversities of the United States that, existed in that period and previously. So divisions around, as was being mentioned earlier, the migration of immigrant, labor largely from Europe, and its impact in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States. The divisions between North and South, which led to this kind of vulgar deal referred to as the Dixiecrats, the deal between the Democratic Party and the North. Religious divisions, especially around Protestant, Catholic, Jewish division. So books like Will Herberg's classic Protestant Catholic Jew is a kind of a piece of that work of nation building in mid 20th century America. And it's easy to forget that when JFK was elected, the idea that a Catholic could be president was inconceivable. And then it happened. And that's part of a kind of capping sign of that process of trying to pull the thing together in that earlier, very white phase of American nation building. In the same way that when Obama was elected, that was another milestone and partly a sign of the kind of multicultural phase of nation building, that was, that could happen, So we should think of these as two different phases in the kind of struggle with the kind of diversity and genuine divisions in society, rather than multiculturalism being somehow the opposite of nation building from a previous period, right? That's the general point I would make. I'll try to now cautiously sort of move on to sort of saying some things about the present situation, COVID. Um, it's it seems to be that, you know, and this is just my kind of layman's view, that when multiculturalism, the kind of struggles around multiculturalism that one observes um, are generally take place in three kind of dimensions. One is a dimension of what we might call symbolic recognition around, you know, representations of history, popular culture, you know, blind casting, controversies over statues, like we've been seeing lately, curricula, decolonizing the curriculum, these kinds of struggles over how the we is being represented. Um, but here, you know, I would strike that note of caution. This is why I was talking about culture earlier. Uh, it's much easier to change symbols than it is to change structures of society, and um, uh, you know, there's a potential for these struggles to, in the symbolic realm, to be met in some ways without actually going deeper into uh, the actual problems. Another terrain in which there's struggles, it seems to me, is always around aspects of how people fit into the division of labor in society. And of course, the division of labor is now very global, which raises a lot of these migration issues that Anna was talking about. Um, but that, but in some ways, you know, the struggles around where people fit into the division of labor, how far they can move up through various kind of sectoral hierarchies in the economy, how people are ethnically segmented and segmented in other ways in terms of the kinds of work they can do. That seems to be a very fundamental and in some ways more thick culture aspect of the problem. And so in the current issues that have gone on, certainly here in the UK, but elsewhere, about uh, BAME, you know, people working in the healthcare system and being at higher risk uh, um, because of where they work, and you know, healthcare is the most, you know, prominent in the public imagination, but there are other kinds of work that has increased the risk and exposure for those people. Means at least there's a context there in which, you know, thinking about, you know, what's fair here in terms of how, for instance, you know, people are distributed in the economy and opportunities for work, and how much risk that puts that in. There's an opportunity for somewhat a debate with more bite, I would sort of say. And then just thirdly, and this will be me finishing up, Daphne, is you know, that there are also struggles over, basically over matters of law and morality, not just who, you know, what's how we, you know, cultural differences in how we define what's right and wrong, often around things like gender norms and child rearing and marriage and those kinds of things, but also about the application of law and you know, even-handed enforcement of law. And obviously the recent period in which issues around Black Lives Matter have been kind of revivified in some ways. You know, that long precedes COVID, but something about the context has somehow, you know, sort of amplified the response to the most recent controversies triggered by the death of George Floyd, sorry. And the so there's a question. I mean, that's heartening. The there's the real problem there, though, is around policing, police systems, and police have their own culture. Police forces around the world are comparable and do similar things that trouble us, precisely because sets of behaviors, beliefs, perceptions by the people who do it are deeply connected to the nature of the work, the nature of the organizations they work in, that have certain kinds of risks and risks of corruption and all sorts of, there's a culture of policing that is a general culture. And that's, you know, and that's again a case of thick culture where the thorny problems are, how do you really police the police in ways that don't just harden them, but actually get them to change, you know, because that's uh, in some ways the nub, you know, the nut that has to be cracked to get progress on that front. So that's, you know, those are some of my, you know, rough responses to or predictions about how some of this COVID stuff might be affecting us. But I'll leave it there.
Okay, wow, thank you very much, Jonathan. That was extremely interesting. And but the last sentence that you said just really is going to stay with me. Police forces have their own culture. I completely agree with that. I think that could lead to some interesting discussion. We're already getting quite a lot of questions. Seeing questions here in the Q&A box and in the chat. We'll pick up on them later. But now, just to introduce our last, but certainly not least speaker. I can't pronounce this name as well as you're not Greek, but this is Professor Christian Jopke, who holds a chair in sociology at the University of Bern in Switzerland. And he will also share his thoughts with us for the next 15 minutes. So Christian, to you.
Okay. I didn't think I would talk about the virus, but I will do. I didn't read many of the commentaries. There's hardly an intellectual who wouldn't have tried to put his signature under that, what happened. The smartest thing I read, and one of the rare things actually I read was by Rudolf Stichweg, who's from the church of Niklas Luhmann. He will not really be known maybe outside of the Germanic language circle. But he wrote an extremely suggestive, imaginative piece in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in the simplest of words. And he used the most arcane and obscure language that contemporary sociology can come up with, which is systems theory. He's from the church of Luhmann. So what was the insight here? Why did I find it compelling? We live in a society of differentiated spheres and functions. Functional differentiation is, in a way, the motor and the constitutive principle of it. We no longer live in a stratified society of estates and orders. I apologize a little bit for the social 101 here, but I guess some of the spectators whom I cannot see here can only see the four principal heads, may find an interest in that. Look, in a society of orders, of estates, each individual completely belonged to just one. And there were not that many. There was a kleros, there was the aristocracy, and then there was the bloody rest that had to work. Now we live in an order, in a society in which each individual belongs to all of the differentiated spheres without exclusively being just in a way a property or belonging to just one of them. So each individual is included in all of the subsystems, in principle at least, the polity, education, but only in that particular respect, not mit Haut und Haaren, as we could say. And as a totality, as an individual, we are outside of this functionally differentiated machine. And that is the biggest provocation of systems theory that a lot of people are uneasy about, that individuals, as individuals, are outside of this functional differentiated sphere. Therefore, our time is one of individualism, because individualism is just that. Individualism would not be possible in a stratified society of orders. It's only possible in functional differentiated contexts. So in a nutshell, functional differentiation on the one side and individualism are mutually dependent, and they're the revolutionary novelties of the kind of society we live in. Now enter Corona. In systems theoretical terms, functional differentiation came to a complete halt. It stopped. It stopped. Why? For the sake of saving individual lives. The survival of the individual was the one imperative, particularly during confinement, against which all other imperatives had to step back. Profit-making, learning, praying, performing in the arts, all of that had to be silenced. And all of that, celebrating the absolute and only value of the individual and her life, was accomplished with the help of the state machine, of the centralized state. The state, next to Zoom, of course, is the biggest winner of the last few months. Even the markets, the capital T markets, had to step back. The whole gospel of neoliberalism, in a way, was sacrificed on the altar of the individual. Liberalism prevailed over neoliberalism. I take a lot of effort these days when I have time to write to get that distinction clear, which a lot of people don't make between liberalism and neoliberalism. State and individual, the two primary pillars of our life in the last 4 months or so. State and individual, you know, Tocqueville and Durkheim had exactly known that they evolve together. And that has been demonstrated by the crisis, even though, of course, as mentioned, at the cost of functionally differentiated subsystems, which are actually by definition globally operating and cannot be contained by borders. They were forcibly put to a standstill. And of course, that can impossibly last. And therefore, now the biggest anxiety today is never, never to slip back to confinement. One could say a lot more. I think, really, I was so convinced when I read that Stichweh, and I only gave you the most brutish parts of it. And he plays it through wonderfully through all other spheres, including the family, including indeed the performing arts, which I mentioned. What the impact of that has been by the Corona experience. Now, what about our key terms? Nationalism on the one side and multiculturalism. What are the implications here? Now, with respect to nationalism, in principle, it should have been a winner for the obvious reason. The instinctive, panicky closing of borders. I wouldn't have imagined that this is possible, and the speed and the copycat proliferation of this closing, it was the most shocking experience in my damn 60 years of life on this planet. So nationalism should be the winner. Think about the new mantra of strategic industries, not to be dependent on China for masks and even for paracetamol, painkillers, and all sorts of things that people now are surprised to discover. Think about how frivolous it appears to us today if our best friend would say, oh, I do vacation in Bali. Wouldn't we say, come on, rent out a bicycle, go to Potsdam, you know, go to some nice parts in your own country. Don't leave that damn carbon copy. There's a nice alliance then between being ecologically nice and friendly to ecology and stick to your own little realm, your own little national realm. So interestingly, nationalism in principle should be the winner. How quiet have the populists been? Who still talks about populism today? You know, they struck terribly bad figures during this crisis. Salvini totally disappeared. Trump probably burned his re-election. And now I really am happy about it. Bolsonaro supposedly has the virus too. In the French local elections, who were the two winners? The two winners were the ecologists and the socialists, but not Marine, who should have profited from it. She kept Perpignan, I think, actually a bigger city than all of the Marxists called. The Marxists, of course, were the single biggest loser, but that was to be expected here. Now, some argue that this experience should strengthen national solidarities, a kind of good everyday sense of solidarity. But I'm not sure at all that that is what the crisis has brought about as a result. There is this notion, yeah, the crisis made us all equal. There was a tweet from Madonna in a bathtub, right? There was a tweet by Arnold Schwarzenegger hanging out in his jacuzzi in Santa Monica, and there was a little lapdog running, smoking a cigar. Stay home, stay home. It was the moment where the college crowd in North America was supposed to go to spring break to Florida. Stay home. It's much nicer to be at home. You know, this sort of we are all equal now from Madonna and from Arnold. I mean, the reality is a family of 5 being confined into a banlieue apartment with a violent, abusive father. I think there is a lot of hypocrisy in this so-called strengthening of national solidarities as a result of this crisis. What is the Unwort of the year? The Germans always have a competition at year's end. What was the ugliest word of the year? Social distancing. Who invented that word? In French, it's even called social distancing. They don't have a French damn word for it in that country that has the Académie Française that watches about not to allow to call a hairdresser, but coiffeur. But social distancing totally flies. Social distancing is an absurdity. We are social animals. We cannot be socially distanced. It's actually, I mentioned the markets were the loser, which is of course not true. The small markets are the losers, the small companies, right, who go bankrupt. Air France will be happily bailed out with billions, and the multinationals will not suffer at all. In that respect, I have to qualify this. The markets had to step back, because if you say social distancing now being preached as a universal gospel of how to behave to one another in an everyday encounter, it reminds me eerily of Margaret Thatcher, who said, there is no such a thing as society. And those who prescribe social distancing, in a way, are part of that creed. There is no such thing as society, a terrible neologism, this social distancing. You know, if you walk a street of a big city, each other individual is a risk factor on 2 legs. And of course, there is this real thing of a virus, Cyrus the virus, but it's also the state that somehow in its clumsily, bossily responds to it, confining people and telling them what to do. You know, that the French slogan was protégez-vous et votre proche. And the notion here is, first you have to protect yourself, but also in order to protect the others. It's a beautiful linkage of first to protect yourself, be autonomous, be self-sufficient yourself, and then in a way the common good will almost naturally evolve. You might think that it's Adam Smith, that is the invisible hand of the market, but I see it more as a neoliberal figure, because this absolutism of isolated individuals is part of the neoliberal deformation of liberalism. I tell you an experience I had. I was playing a harmless ball game with my boy who was studying in England, but he had to come back with the last fast train. So we were happily together or unhappily together in confinement. We played a harmless ball game. Then there was an asshole behind the bush who was shouting at us and not making his face visible, "Go home, respect confinement, respect the rules, I will call the police." You know what this reminded me of is a Blockwart in the Blockwart, which I have read about in Hans Fallada, Jeder stirbt für sich allein, a Blockwart, a Nazi kind of neighborhood sheriff who had here, it's said, this kind of reappearance. Social distancing will do a lot of damage. Why was it not called physical distancing? Why was it called social distancing? Who invented that crap? Multiculturalism. I have nothing to say about that. I think I'm actually already over my time. It's amazing with a few words one can rant kind of ad infinitum, isn't it? Multiculturalism. Only so much about that. Interestingly, the first political articulation, independent of the virus, in the last 4 months is the Black Lives Matter movement, isn't it? And of course, in the United States of America, you can totally understand it. Racism is the original sin of the United States, and I'm skeptical that they will ever get over that. But the spreading of it to Berlin, to Amsterdam. Now there's a big movement in Germany. I mean, think about structural racism in the German police. That's a contradiction in terms. You know, a few years ago, hordes of North African intoxicated males were attacking hundreds of women at the Domplatz in Cologne, that famous event which brought the welcome culture in Germany in the course of this Syrian refugee crisis to a very sudden halt. No police person dared to intervene because they are so totally horrified of doing brutish things which could be interpreted as racist. And now, you know, the interesting thing about the Black Lives Matter movement is the spreading and the speed, even to places where you would not expect it. And of course, in serious legal policy terms, what is being claimed here is non-discrimination or anti-discrimination. And that is not the same as multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is into groups, into particularism, into the recognition of difference, whereas anti-discrimination is actually about abolishing difference to the degree that it's something that harms the individual. Of course, however, this anti-discrimination legal fundament of Black Lives Matter comes in distinctly multicultural identitarian terms. I will stop here and simply say so much. It's interesting that the first independent political moment post-COVID was sort of a crypto multicultural moment. This multiculturalism, however, more in terms of thin diversity, which also business schools preach in their curriculum for MBA students, and in alliance with the non-discrimination policies, will, I think, stay the signature feature of our contemporary societies. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Christian, quite a lot there. But I'm sure we'll pick up on a lot of what everyone said in the Q&A. So I would, if I can ask you to please just type in your questions. We have quite a lot already. So how about I start with 3 questions I have already, and then I'll keep renewing them. We have about half an hour to go. So let me start, if I can pose a question to the whole panel. And this is actually, I'm a comparativist by training myself. So this was one of the ones that I found really interesting. So I will ask this one first. So someone posed a comparative question. They ask, is there any evidence that mobility has been restricted less in multicultural states? So can we witness any variation between countries that we consider to be multicultural or not? And does that tell us something about how these countries have imposed border closures or mobility restrictions? And then I have a question for Anna in particular, and that is, what new norms of membership are you proposing? And to follow up on that, how can we make non-citizens less vulnerable? So I guess maybe Jonathan could also follow up on that. You talked about structures and about the structures of culture. So is that a way, or is the issue really structural here? I have another question for the whole panel. That is, so the coronavirus does not discriminate between citizens and non-citizens. How does that translate essentially in the way that we treat non-citizens? Will that mean a change? A question to Jonathan. What are the legal implications of multiculturalism? And I have a question for Christian myself, if I may. And that is because you picked up on my topic, which is populism and the far right. So I guess my question, you said that while nationalism should have been the winner, actually it's not, because we haven't seen the populists gain. So my question to you is, first, the fact that we haven't seen populists gain, does that mean that nationalism hasn't been a winner? Perhaps nationalism has been a winner, but manifested in a totally different way, not in votes for populists. And second, isn't that rather early to tell? So for the moment, as you very, very nicely put, the survival of the individual has come first. But when the economic crisis comes looming, will maybe the populists make gains then? So I'll stop here now and hear your answers, and then we'll have a second round shortly. Shall we go with order of talk? So Anna first.
Well, thank you very much, Daphne. And thank you, Jonathan and Christian, for very interesting reflections. Actually, I'll take advantage and ask a question to Jonathan for when his turn is. So are you, Jonathan, suggesting that so we've seen, Catholics were taboo and then JFK came. Black people were taboo and then Obama came. So can we hope that this is a linear process of diversifying and, including, I'm not sure how to call it this, because you might say visible minority people, you might say, anyway, breaking down barriers if you want. So I think that was a very interesting reflection if we try really to put the Black Lives Matter movement into kind of a more long-term context and not just focus on police violence or prejudice. And I hope, Christian, I misunderstood you, that towards the end of your talk, you seem to be saying the German police is so afraid to be accused for discrimination and racism that they're not. So perhaps you can clarify that. Maybe I misunderstood you, because I would be both very happy, but also very surprised to find out that German police is immune to the issue. In terms of, thank you very much for the very interesting questions. I think I've been one of these people that didn't think that denizenship makes a lot of sense. I don't know if Yasmin Soysal is with us today, but you remember Yasmin was writing, I think it was 94, 95, that we've gone past national citizenship to other forms of membership. And I think what happened in the decades in between was actually militating against this prediction. But I wonder, and I hope actually, that a kind of transnational threat like the pandemic, which is not an earthquake that is localized, it's not a war where you can even say, it's this Middle Eastern people's fault, they always fight with each other, or it's these other people's fault that they, so it's something that affects us all, and it can make us rethink what is effective membership versus the more, how can I say, normative aspects of citizenship. And of course, the requirement remains, and again, I don't know if we have Reiner among us, Reiner Babak, the requirement remains that political community needs some elements to function, but can we give a bit more emphasis into effective membership and solidarity towards your fellow members, which translates also into responsibility? I think we can, and I also remember a student of Reiner who defended his PhD a few years back in Florence, his name will come, who was speaking about something called jus domicilii. And he was quite radical in his argument, but he was saying, I think a version of what we're talking about, so that effective residence should be the ultimate criterion, not birth and genealogical origin. And actually in the same way, he was saying, if you are absent, if somebody like me or Daphne, if you're absent for a long time, and not even a very long time, say 2 or 3 years from your country of citizenship, you shouldn't be allowed to have political rights there. It should be a dormant citizenship unless you go back and live in the country and have your effective membership in the country. So I think really the pandemic prompts us to think about it, and like some other questions raise the same issue. You know, what about if the health of citizens depends on the health of non-citizens? So in that sense, we are in it together. In the sense that we are interdependent, and we are interdependent both from the more disadvantaged manual worker to the rock star to the scientist. At the same time, we're certainly not in this together, either nationally or transnationally, I think for reasons that also Christian mentioned. But also I would like to mention that while we've seen great examples of transnational solidarity, so in between, so for instance, among European countries, you know, lending IC unit places to adjacent regions, even across national borders. If you want, I can also, I think I can also mention the example of the Canadian Prime Minister refusing to retaliate when the Trump administration blocked some protective equipment from coming to Canada that had been ordered and paid and was badly needed. And some people called on Trudeau to stop health workers from Windsor crossing the border to the United States. And Trudeau said, I'm not going to do this because this is not the way I do politics. And I think that there's something to be said there. So is this, in a way, I think that the pandemic is both a crisis and an opportunity. And as you said, Daphne, we've seen borders were not so important anymore for a number of reasons and in different regions of the world. And suddenly borders became important again. But I think we have the seeds of an opportunity there to rethink also. It's one thing to say the functional borders, which can also be regional borders. We've seen lockdowns right now in specific places in Germany, for instance, or in Spain. So to say these are functional borders just for the sake of a specific health emergency, and political borders become more permeable through a kind of higher ethical and political order, not a strict understanding of national citizenship and national interest. And I wanted to also kind of conclude my comment or my answer by raising a question. Christian, you said something about the survival of the individual, and that's very interesting what you said. Yeah, we sacrificed everything: profit making, training, creating, working, hanging out with our loved ones. You know, we practice actually distant socializing. We still socialize, but distantly. I've socialized with a lot of friends from abroad these days that I wouldn't have socialized in if I wasn't at home, but through a camera. But and you raised this very good question, why? And we've empowered the state to do this. Now, I think it's not about the individual. I think it's something about the sacredness of life and the fact that we all have one life to live. So if you're gone, you're gone. There's no thing. Which in relation to nationalism may make us think, you know, we know, you know, for Anthony Smith, the quintessential question about nationalism is, are you prepared to die for your nation? So it's worth dying for your nation, but it's not worth dying for the virus and for some people being irresponsible. So I think this is the crux, not of the question, not individualism. But I do think also, and I would like to hear Jonathan and Christian and also the questions about the state coming back with a vengeance, but also experts coming back with a vengeance. And maybe Daphne, you want to say something. I mean, having the luxury of having you here, you must say something about, you know, the state and experts coming back with a vengeance against populists. But maybe we need not underestimate the power of populism and the fact that in some social media bubbles, there is still talk about how this is constructed. It doesn't exist. It's all, you know, conspiracy of whatever, the elites of Zionists or of whoever have you. So there again, I think there's something to be discussed, and thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Great. Jonathan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a ended up with a kind of list of questions to me in particular, but also that general question about mobility, and whether it's more open in multicultural states. This is the case where I'm going to invoke my card to defer to the other two, because I don't have really good comparative knowledge off the top of my head. Although, you know, my question back to the question is, well, what do you mean by mobility? Do you mean ability to move somewhere and become a citizen, or do you just mean ability to move there and perhaps work as a non-citizen? That's, those are rather different things and have a lot of bearing on whether or not we're comparing multiculturalism by that criteria across countries. I kind of bit off to the side. I just also thought I would insert that we're talking about this question of impact of COVID and multiculturalism, but of course the great axis of differentiation of COVID is age, which tends to fall out of our categories of multiculturalism because we all age, right? But that's one of the kind of larger social divisions and distributions of risk that's invoked by this particular case, and tensions between younger people who are less likely to get seriously ill or die and want to get back to work, and and older people who are at greater risk are in some ways the most fundamental tensions. And that tension, the interests of older people and younger people, is also one of the shape, especially in maturing European America, cultures, is one of the shaping factors of what the state has to attend to. I mean, part of the reasons healthcare systems, even before this, were becoming expensive is because we're all aging, and so that's kind of just throwing something in from the side. Someone asked, how can we make non-citizens less vulnerable? Yes. One of these things where you wish you had a magic wand. I guess I'm still inclined to connect that problem. I don't have any kind of simple answers, but to part of what I was saying earlier about the importance of work and the importance of labor. I mean, for me, a lot of it hinges on having a system where you say working gives you entitlement to citizenship, to rights. And so in the U.S., U.S. was very lax about its southern border for many years because it was just pulling up undocumented labor from Mexico, and it's moving around the United States, and it's only become that's only become a kind of a political issue in recent decades. But the issue is not it yes, where you live, jus domesticus, or whatever the term was that Anna was using, but also where do you work and where do you contribute, and of course that problem of the vulnerability of the non-citizen is complexly bound up with the fact that labor is brought into countries but not recognized as citizens, at the same time that labor is exported by large corporate interests to other countries. There's that's a fundamental nut to crack. Another question was, what are the legal implications of multiculturalism? That's a very big question. All I can really say there is that I think ultimately, it kind of connects back to some things I was trying to say earlier. Ultimately, for multiculturalism to have any sort of clear legal implication, it has to somehow be linked to something that we all share. It's not just the diversity angle. It's some sort of definition of a national group of citizenship that allows this diversity, but at the same time, one's entitlement to protection under the law is in some ways, rising above and over those multicultural issues. I mean, multiculturalism, just sheer diversity implies its opposite. What is the thing that ties us all together? And it's, I think it's some notion of citizenship rights. I was also asked, by Anna, is this a linear process of diversification, breaking down barriers? She was invoking the little quick comparison I made between JFK as a Catholic president and Obama as a Black president. I certainly wouldn't want to be seen as having a really optimistic Whiggish view of history, that things just progress, inevitably. Would that it were so. I mean, I think I was trying to say more that each period that I was sort of doing a kind of 2-period version of US history, and each one has its own kind of problems and its own symbol of, to some degree, surmounting those problems. Having said that, it's, it is better now than it was even when I was a kid, and, than it was, before the 1960s. I mean, there, certainly in terms of race relations, as much as there are these sticking problems about mobility and opportunities, and particularly around the treatment of Black people in the United States by the police force, or police forces. That's another issue. There are many of them. It's a federal country and it's complex. There is a slow progress. As much as we, there seemed to be progress through the 60s and the 70s, and then it slows down. And, I tend to attribute this to economic changes and the general neoliberal or rightward shift of politics. But I do have a sense that with the kind of issue around policing, to some degree, the problem is being kettled into a specific area where, to play with that term, and in some ways that's good because, there's a place to focus the fight. If we can crack this particular problem, at least we will have made another clear step forward. But I think it was Christian who said, but I don't know if this race problem in the States will ever be solved. And I don't want to appear to be making light of it. Electing a Black president doesn't solve it, and it's very deep. At the same time, I don't think it's adequate to try and understand the entire populist Trump phenomena in terms of racial conflict. I mean, that's there in the mix. It's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. That's one of the things that's really difficult about this kind of populist moment, is that it's, any large political coalition that can achieve, electing a president is a complex mixture thing. They're not as unified as they appear, and political strategy has to hold on to that as a hope. So I'll stop there, but there's some responses to several questions.
Great, thank you very much. Christian?
Daphne said it's too early to know whether populists will lose or win. Well, we don't know the future. I fully agree with that. I think it has been a paradox in the French political scene that the local, in terms of the political forces that dominate there, show a completely different constellation from the national level. And that is no innovation of the crisis. Locally, ecologists are very strong. A lot of cities vote socialist. See Paris. I mean, they even sold their headquarters on Rue Solferino. The socialists, they are extinct. They are dinosaurs. Not even that. They are skeletons. But she wins overwhelmingly. So that is a paradox here, that you have at the national level Le Pen and still Macron, and nothing else, and at the local level a completely different constellation. But however, I stick to my intuition here, a more flippant intuition, that the populists have made brutta figura in the last few months. If the last polls in the United States, which is too early to say, a lot of things can happen before November, tell us something, that now the Donald is in the loser's corner. Who would have thought about that 4 months ago? And all sorts of, everybody thought he has a totally consistent reservoir of, Hillary called them the basket of deplorables, who, whatever he would do in terms of atrocious remarks, would just reinforce them. But he seems to have lost even within his fan club. That's an amazing phenomenon. So of course, we will have to see how it works out in other countries. It's also, you know, before all of that happened, I thought populism was one of the main issues in public debate. The Germans had nothing else to struggle about than what would happen to the AfD, the leadership struggles there, and the silly things they distribute in parliament. And they had no other topic in domestic politics in that country but the extreme right. And kind of these guys, well, we are all happy that it happened. For the moment, at least, have been silenced. Of course, that is something that can change very quickly. About the German police, look, I don't know whether they're racist or not. I never heard anything particularly troubling about German police behavior in that respect. What I try to say is that what is with us is this sensibility of diversity, of being nice to minorities, of avoiding racism and racist talk. In Germany, though, they, in all seriousness, talk about removing the word race from the Grundgesetz, from the Constitution, because it appears there in what is actually the equality article, that nobody may be discriminated on the basis of one's, and then comes sex, religion, ethnic background, but also race and Rasse. And the Germans, I mean, they are so terribly, how to say, paranoid. Even the word race cannot be said. I just produced in the textbook a chapter on nationalism, ethnicity, and race. And the editor wouldn't allow me to use the word Rasse in German without quotation marks. And I hate quotation marks. Unless I quote somebody, I don't use quotation marks. It's terribly unaesthetic to litter a text with quotation marks. You see, going back actually to this point, did multicultural states impose less mobility restrictions? This is a very refined idea of what multiculturalism is. I think French society in many ways is deeply multicultural, deeply influenced by the diction of diversity. And of course, in France, it violates certain republican norms, that there are only citizens around and nothing in between the citizen and the state. But look at the pronunciations of Macron's latest government. There is one guy now who replaced Castaner, the guy, this unhappy chief of his police troops, a kind of clueless guy from the province. I forgot the name of the new guy. And the new guy is terribly proud in all public to talk about his Algerian background and that his parents are Hakis and how moved he is. Look, I don't judge a politician, but by whatever his background is, I judge her or him by his quality in the job. So he should shut up, not talk about his background, but deliver and do good interior policies. France is in a fine-grained way in every day as multicultural as any other liberal society, which obeys to the gospel of diversity. This is with us. This will stay with us. And I talk a bit cynically about it. It's also good. It's also good this way, but we shouldn't exaggerate. Now to dig into racism in the German police. You know what that reminds me of? John Mayer once wrote a brilliant article where he illustrated his world culture theory with a thought experiment. Think about a new island being discovered somewhere in the South Sea. What would this new island do? It would, of course, want to be recognized as a sovereign nation state. It would establish a police. It would establish a science, environmental ministry, even though there wouldn't be any objective need for that. This is the talk of our time, kind of the language in which we talk, and a thinned down multiculturalism in terms of diversity just is a central part of it. And life versus the individual. That's an interesting observation. I simply took it here from Stichweg's a very interesting commentary, and he says, die ungeheure Bedeutsamkeit des Individuums in der modernen Gesellschaft, the incredible importance of the individual in our modern society shows in the coronavirus, in the fact that no other consideration or value could compete with the highest value of the survival of as many individuals as possible. And also Anna said, yeah, I find it difficult to take the individual apart from the one life that each individual has. We indeed only have one life. We cannot put on several lives like we change our t-shirt. So, but it's an interesting question whether bare life, to use this pop philosophical jargon, is something different from the individual. The word individualism is a little bit clumsy here. The individual is really the central principle in this crisis. Whether you should call it individualism is perhaps questionable. Okay, I think I said everything.
Okay, thank you so much. What I will do is I will pose one last question for each of you to answer quickly. But before I do that, I want to take up what Anna said and actually just say one thing, since I've been also hearing all this interesting discussion. So I just want to say something from my own perspective as someone who studies the far right and populism and nationalism. And I think what is interesting from the way I see it with the coronavirus is that indeed the coronavirus has had very surprising results and or responses rather, and actually no patterns. As comparativists, we seek to find commonalities and differences, and yet these were not there. So funnily enough, the Western European countries that had very high health indexes that we expected to perform really well, like the UK or the US, actually did really poorly. Democracies have not necessarily done well. For example, we see some states like Vietnam having done very, very well. We also see some countries like my own, like Greece, that had populism and that had economic crisis and severe constraints for years, actually faring so much better than these Western nations. So there is a surprise factor, really. Another is that there hasn't actually been a populist pattern either. So we can't say that all populists have performed, countries with populist leaders or populist parties have performed well or have performed poorly. There is, again, variation. So to me, what is really interesting about the coronavirus is that it has exposed variations that are counterintuitive. But one thing that they do share, or that we can note, is what you have mentioned, the power of the state. I was thinking constantly when I was trying to observe these patterns, this book, How Democracies Die by Ziblatt and Levitsky, and I think that is quite the point. Perhaps the coronavirus has exposed that maybe populism, maybe there's no pattern because that's not the right word to use. Maybe it's not about the people versus the elite. Maybe it's not about a buzzword that we use as an umbrella to denote everybody we don't like. Maybe what it's really about is authoritarianism. So one thing that we definitely do see is that there has been an opportunity, or the coronavirus has been used as an opportunity by leaders to strengthen their powers. That has happened in Hungary, that has happened in Poland, that has even happened in the US, that has happened in Brazil, that has happened in many cases. So perhaps if we strip all these facades and leave it bare, what we do see is that this is a crisis. And unlike what we might think, this is not an unprecedented crisis. We've had pandemics before, we've had shock factors before, we've had crisis before. And whenever there's a crisis, there is an opportunity to seize power in the name of saving the individual or society or whoever from the crisis. And I think that that is the one and only common factor. And that is one thing that we really need to study, is to see which are going to be the states that at the end of this crisis will prove to have those institutions that are resilient to the type of authoritarianism that perhaps certain leaders would want to seize. So, but just to end, my question to you, based on a question that we've had, or broadening a question that we've had with what I have just thought here, is, do you see the coronavirus as posing certain structural changes? Do you think that what we will see, and I'm not asking you to see the future, because we know as political or as scientists we don't do that, but what we do is by the patterns, observing the patterns that we do have, we can make assumptions about what will take place. So the question is, are these changes structural? Is this a crisis that will create severe structural important changes, or is it really something that in a couple of years will be forgotten and we'll go back to the kind of nationalism, populism, or whatever else authoritarianism that we already had? Maybe I'll change the order. I'll go with Jonathan first, Christian second, and I will leave the last word to Anna.
Okay, thank you. The short answer is I'm a bit skeptical about profound structural changes because of coronavirus. I mean, one of the things is we forget, for all the incredible kind of shutting down of economies we've done, it's not that deadly a pandemic as pandemics go, right? So one of the remarkable things is what, why did that moment of, herd immunity or whatever, it was like, Johnson wanted to do it and it was sort of there, and the Swedes sort of tried it, but everybody else pulled back. And I think it's partly because it's just impossible to build a narrative around that of, we're better off having a few people die, more people die, and keeping our economy going. And you can make complex arguments about the trade-offs of death and stuff, but the idea that the leaders of a country would treat their citizens and their lives in such a cavalier manner, especially when they have now the health capacity in their healthcare systems to prevent it, it's morally unimaginable in a way that it would have been imaginable 100 years ago, because we wouldn't have had the capacity. So there's something about that. But I think the other thing I would say is just no, in the sense of, one of the striking things now is that we're still printing money like crazy and just like debt, what debt, who cares, as much as you need to, put people on furlough and deal with the problem. But, we stepped into that bizarre structural situation in 2008. And we have been there ever since. So there's something, that's the big structural issue. And it precedes the crisis, and it may eventually cause structural changes, but this is just one more kind of bump in that larger question of funding, large states in the context of economic slowdown, and basically a world economy that's very much based on the strength of the dollar, which is based on oil in the global economy and the U.S. economy. So the actual ecological crisis. There's a funny way in which this, as we've all said, this experience has given us this kind of weird foretaste of, we've been sort of forced to be ecologically more sensible, and there are other things we can do, and it's kind of given us a foretaste. I tend to be a bit skeptical that people won't quickly forget once, there's a vaccine and there's a capacity to try to go back to normal, but that doesn't mean the actual problem, ecological problem, isn't still waiting there, which is the real structural problem that will catch up with us. This coronavirus has just given us a kind of strange foretaste of things we might do about it, but it itself is not, you know, a deep structural problem. It's something we have to work through. So that would be my quick response to it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Christian.
This is the most significant public event in my life. I cannot think of anything else that had similar significance. The earliest big public event, Kennedy was shot. I was 4 years old. I remember exactly where I was. I was under a chair in our living room, and my folks watched television, and then I heard that Kennedy was shot. I remember Kennedy wurde erschossen. I had no idea what Kennedy was, and, what erschossen means, but it was in my mind. It's printed there. I knew exactly where I was when the Twin Towers fell. I was in a curve, driving with my car from San Domenico to Florence, and I remember the utter disbelief. My Italian was always a bit shaky, even then when it shouldn't have been shaky. And I at first thought that was some fake news in the radio or some, what is aliens? Some alien that closed the airports. So what really happened? But I remember it was shock like, no, this damn virus thing had no beginning. No significant beginning. And it has no end. We're still talking in this crippled, emasculated form to one another. Zoom has become the new normal. And I fear that this will be perhaps the most life-changing impact, that virtuality, not to meet people anymore, will become the new normal. And I bet we are all academics. It's so much cheaper to do this Zoom events, right? Next week, there's one, actually Daphne will join it in Singapore. So you don't, you know, the Singaporeans always let you fly in business class. It was always big fun, and you could drink with the people, and, you know, here's my Stella Artois, you could have fun, right? All of that is gone. All of that is gone. The screen, virtuality, not real people anymore. I think that is dangerous. I think it will breed violence, because you don't have a sense of other people, of the fragility of life anymore. You know, these kids behind their PlayStations, and my own kids, unfortunately, are also a victim of this plague. They shoot, and they kill, and then these figures, they pop up again. They don't know what killing means, right? So I never was that naive to believe that kids cannot make a distinction between these games and real life. They can make that distinction, but in a way, it's the PlayStationization of our way of being with other people, not being with them anymore, because it's so convenient, because it's less costly, it's less risky, right? This is dangerous, and we should avoid it. Whenever I get Zoom invitations, my first instinct is, no, thank you. I wanted to share pints with Jonathan and maybe with Daphne, where you would have been in Edinburgh, you know, to have fun. So I felt committed, and I felt committed to the guys in Singapore because they had invited me nicely only 2 years ago. But we should avoid and deny these Zoom webinar bullshit stuff, because it will kind of atrophy and impoverish now our life as academics. But I think it's quite similar, even though business traveling may not be as nice as academic traveling, even if they use business class. I always like to do it, and I think for somebody who has to do it compulsively for a living, they will be relieved actually to do it rather from their home office. So there are two sides to these things, but that I fear most. And my last word, where was Europe in all of that? When all the borders closed, I just couldn't believe it. I thought that was Schengen. Sure, one knows there's an exception. Everything is always the rule of the exception, right? But the velocity and the lack of any disagreement with which the borders went up, as if that would protect ourselves from the aliens, from the alien virus, whatever it is. I found that shocking. And I have to say, Europe performed extremely badly in this crisis, and that will show in the future of this crippled undertaking called the European Union.
Wow, thank you very much for all that. And now I shall have Anna give us the last word.
I think, Christian, if you were to say the last word, we could go all kill ourselves. I'll try to lift the spirits. No, and reassure you that in my center, we are planning real events for next year, but of course we are, we will have to adapt if things take a negative turn in terms of our health safety. Yeah, I think Athena, Leosi, Daphne, and me should have a separate webinar meeting to decide how is it that Greece did so well. It's good diaspora Greeks, but jokes apart, I think, and it was about a month ago in a webinar with Tarek Madoud and Craig Calhoun, we were talking about Sweden and then comparing the US, Canada, Greece. What is the secret? Why are things working? And I think, Daphne, this speaks to your comment. I think it's about leadership. So, I mean, we need to factor in leadership. And of course, I do see that in Sweden, in general, the civic culture is more a culture of trust to the citizen and responsibility than it is in Greece, which is more a culture of distrust of the citizen, between the citizen and the state trying to control the citizen. But there was one thing, at least in Greece, that I think worked, which was that the messaging was coherent in all walks of leadership. And I would say, for instance, in Canada, and although that's probably the first and last similarity between Greece and Canada, is there was also consistent messaging. So the political leadership, the scientific leadership, they were given a coherent message. And that is different from Britain, Sweden, and the US. Although these are, again, very different countries, but where there were contradictory messages. And I think that is something to be factored in if we're talking also about democracy and authoritarianism. And I think what you said, Jonathan, is also, I think, very important. You said today it's morally unimaginable that people die to save the economy. While a century ago, it's not that it would be morally imaginable for people to die to save the economy, but it's just that we were much more reconciled with life and death. So death was seen as much more a part of life, while now it was seen as different, which leads me to think that this has something to do with, if you want, risk society, however you want to call it, or postmodern society, control over nature, control over our destiny. And there is a bare sense of equality in that sense, not a sense of bare life, but a bare sense of equality that we all have the right to live. And this is an ultimate, you cannot go below that. And this is a bare equality that we all have, which, however, exposes all the more complex inequalities and the different types of solidarity that we can have. And maybe, Daphne, to respond to your question, that can be a good point of departure for structural changes. Now, I think, even if you, when your trajectory, even if you move it to like 2 centimeters, it will lead you to a different place. So I think that's the question we're facing. And I like your question. So is this just a temporary hiccup? Or I think we will see a very small move of the needle which, however, will probably lead to something more substantial. And I think it's still very open for us, for all of us, whether this is just a crisis or it is an opportunity. I personally think it can also be an opportunity despite the huge loss of life. That is nothing to forget, and we haven't talked about it, but it is tragic. So many people died, so many people are dying, and it is not everyone. So we know that older people die, and people who are socioeconomically more vulnerable die more than others, despite public health systems.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sadly, we've run out of time. We're 10 minutes over, so we do have to stop just as we were warming up. And I can see we've kept most of our participants, so it looks like everybody has enjoyed it. I agree with Christian that this is not a substitute for face-to-face, but I do think that we are lucky that we can have it, and we have been able to have this meeting and get this interesting discussion going. If you have enjoyed it, please stay in touch with ASEN. We have more events coming up, so hopefully you can take part in these as well. And have a good morning, evening, afternoon, or wherever you are. And the panelists, please stay online for a few minutes so that we can say goodbye. Thank you.